So, at the end of the last part, I hypothesized that St. James was represented only over battlegrounds and massacres in Mexico. So, where are the notable battlegrounds and massacres? Well, they're all here, in the narrow strip of land between Mexico City and the coast of Veracruz, where Cortes landed. That isn't to say that the colonization of the rest of Mexico is peaceful, because it wasn't, but it was different. Anyway, having scoured the rest of Mexico from Oaxaca to Baja and from Tulum to Tzintzuntzan, I have to say that I've been looking in every church and I haven't found any trace of St. James, but I have finally found it. A church dedicated to and prominently displaying St. James that is nowhere near any major battle site. The Church of Santiago de Nuevo León. During the conquest, there were no major battles for hundreds of miles of Santiago de Nuevo León, and it's interesting to take a step back and ask why that is. The first thing to understand is that this is Chichimec country. Who are the Chichimeca, you may ask, using the correct word for the people somehow, and that's a good question. If you were a conquistador in the 1520s and you were invading Mexico, you would be faced with some interesting options. Mexico at the time had a very complicated and fragmented political geography, as did the United States. In the east, there was the Yucatan, jungle territory, where the Maya ruled. Fallen from greatness in many ways before the Spanish arrived, they were living as small competing city-states within the jungle, rather than the grand metropolises and alliances of the classical era. We can't cover the classic Maya collapse, but it's a fascinating and controversial topic in anthropology circles. In the central highlands, where there's plains and good farmland, that's where the Aztecs ruled, and they controlled an empire of around 6 million subjects. They had roads, they collected tribute, and they were able to mobilize more than 500,000 men for war, which made them the military superpower of their region, and they were actively expanding at the time that Cortes arrived. In the north are the arid deserts where the Chichimec rule. The Chichimeca are nomadic people who live in small groups of only a few families. They have no capacity to organise for war, and there are just sort of lots of different bands of them moving nomadically over the country there. They speak languages in the Nahuatl family, like the Aztecs, but they're culturally very distinct, and the population density of the north is just much, much lower because the land is sort of arid and not very good. So that's why they're not farmers, they're nomadic. There are several other culturally distinct groups and languages within Mexico. There are the Zapotecs in Oaxaca, the Otomi in Veracruz, the Purepecha in Morelos, whose language and technology is more similar to the Incas than it is to the Aztecs, leading some to theorize that they are descended from a migration that came down the coastal route on boats, while the Aztecs and other Nahuatl-speaking groups are descended from a migration that came down over land. Even within the Aztec Empire, there were lots of cities who spoke the same language but considered themselves separate nations that paid the Aztec tribute rather than a part of the Aztec Empire. No one ever said they were Aztec. They would have said that they were Mexica or Texcocan or Alcohuan or Huetzotzincan or any one of 100 other individual city-states that the Aztec Empire was sort of built of. And the Aztec Empire was not an empire in our Western sense, really, because they didn't directly control the other groups, all of the groups within the empire. They just all paid a tribute, but they weren't ruled as such. It's interesting, if you look at Europe, you see that there are all these really small countries with their distinct languages and cultures. And if Mexico and the US had never been flattened by colonization, they would have had a sort of similar mosaic of different languages and cultures. But they got flattened by colonization, so that's why they're these huge, big sort of countries, and all the countries in Europe are tiny. Anyway, coming back to the conquistadors problem, you could start with the Chichimecs in the arid north, the Aztecs in the central highlands, or the Maya in the humid east. Which of those groups do you think would be best to target first in an invasion? A, B, or C? If you said A, the Chichimecs, or C, the Mayans, then congratulations, Juan de Grijalva. There's a reason that history has forgotten you. If you said B, the Aztecs, then congratulations, Cortez, you conquered Mexico. It is a bit counterintuitive because the Aztecs are the strongest civilization on paper, and they certainly fielded the largest armies. But what the Aztecs had that the Mayans, and especially the Chichimecs, lacked was a culture of state. You see, in Aztec society, peasant farmers had a lord to whom they owed a portion of their harvest, and that lord likely paid tribute to and sometimes raised soldiers on behalf of a greater lord, and so on, up to the Aztec emperor. In this case, you can just win a few pitched battles, kill all of the Aztec elite, and usurp their position at the top of their society. All the tribute payments then flow to you, just as they had to Montezuma before, and society can continue. This is a win. In contrast, in the north, the Chichimecs pay no tribute to any lord. They have no governing structure or ability to raise armies, but that just means you're subject to raids and guerrilla warfare when you're in their territory. And if you wipe out one band of Chichimecs, it changes nothing. These people will never pay tribute. They're nomadic hunter-gatherers. They don't have any surplus they could use to pay anyway. They don't really have any property, and they don't recognize any authority outside their immediate tribal group, which might be only a few families. So, it's really just hard to integrate them into sort of colonial economic structures. They just get in the way, which is why the Chichimecs were annihilated completely in the end. But the Aztecs, who are much easier to integrate into colonial capitalist structures, were sort of survived in much greater numbers. And so, yeah, central Mexico fell after a single decisive campaign. But the Mayan and Chichimec areas, they've, held out. There was prolonged guerrilla warfare there over centuries, where there were never pitched battles between armies, but the settlers who moved in were sort of continually harassed and had to defend themselves from small roving bands of Chichimecs who would sort of sweep through the countryside. But they were all eventually kind of wiped out. Anyway, all of this does mean that there is not a notable battle within 100 miles of Santiago de Nuevo León, so St. James isn't only represented on battlegrounds after all. Walking around the town, it is interesting to see that there are a lot of references to Santiago de Compostela on signposts and on restaurants, and the church itself has pictures of St. James, but only as the patron saint of pilgrims in his pilgrim form with hat and staff. And he also appears in his pilgrim form on a nearby pillar with the cross of St. James. So it's interesting to see that he's uniformly displayed here in his pilgrim form. The rules seem to be, if you see St. James as Santiago Matamoros with his white horse and his sword, that means you're in a church that's built on a battleground site. And if you see St. James as the patron saint of pilgrims, then you're not.